Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Can you imagine such a crazy king that set his own palace on fire with everyone? Carlos VI of France, King Insane, left us a chilling story. Discover the truth after this terrible event. Subscribe and activate the bell so as not to miss anything. You imagine a young, promising king, heir to a powerful dynasty, and then, suddenly, madness. That is what happened to Carlos VI of France. His reign, which began with hope, was quickly eclipsed by episodes of dementia that marked him forever and that, today, still intrigue us. What really happened to Carlos VI? Was it a disease? A conspiracy? That is the question that historians have persecuted for centuries, and that we will try to unravel together. His first crisis reached the age of 23. Suddenly, during a hunt, the young Rey fell into a state of deep madness. He stopped recognizing his relatives, spoke inconsistencies. A radical and scary change. These episodes were repeated throughout their reign, leaving the kingdom in chaos and political uncertainty. The instability of his mind had devastating consequences for France. Some point to a mental illness, perhaps schizophrenia, others talk about poisoning or even a conspiracy to weaken the monarchy. The truth is that, despite the centuries, it is still a mystery. The lack of precise medical records of the time hinders the task, turning the case of Carlos VI into a fascinating enigma. The described symptoms are vague and allow various interpretations. He was born in Paris in 1368, a small child who, from his crib, was destined for an uncertain future. Carlos VI, heir to the French throne, grew in the opulence of the court, surrounded by courtiers and the expectation of a glorious reign. But a prince's life is not a fairy tale, right? Imagine pressure, rigorous education, constant surveillance. His father, Carlos V, was a cunning and powerful king who built a solid empire. Carlos VI, however, was very young when his father died. Just 12 years, the weight of the crown fell on his inexperienced shoulders. Suddenly, he was the king, the head of the fate of France, a vast and complex country. The rise to the throne at such an early age was not a walk. Imagine the court, full of ambitious nobles, fighting for power, palatial intrigues that were surely woven behind them. He had to learn quickly to navigate that dangerous political sea, to gain respect for the powerful, to make crucial decisions for the nation. A king, with the world in his hands. But Carlos VI's golden childhood was truncated by the 100 years. You already know that France and England were engaged in a brutal struggle for the control of territories and power. At T11, Carlos was declared king after the death of his father, Carlos V, and the weight of the crown fell on his inexperienced shoulders, just in the middle of the conflict. The first years of his reign were marked by instability. The war continued with crucial battles such as Rupes, where the French suffered an overwhelming defeat. Imagine the pressure on such a young king, facing military defeat and the growing distrust of the nobility. The situation was even more complicated with internal disputes between the French nobles. The rivalry between different features and the ambition for the power to undermine the stability of the kingdom. You can imagine intrigue and betrayal in court, while Carlos VI, just a teenager, tried to control a situation that escaped his hands. The war with England continued, consuming resources and weakening further to France. Military campaigns were expensive and exhausting, and the French people suffered the consequences of the prolonged fight. For you, the image of a torn kingdom by war and the lack of firm leadership must be clear. The war, stress and death of his father, Carlos V, left a deep mark on the young king. T20, Carlos VI already showed signs of instability. One day, in the middle of a hunt, he suffered an episode that changed his life forever. A nervous breakdown that left him completely disoriented and fearful. This event, although not immediately obvious, marked the beginning of a mental decline that would end up defining its reign. But the event that truly alarmed the court was the Locos dance. Imagine the scene. A real dance with noble and ladies of the court wearing his best galas. But suddenly, the king, dressed in crazy clothes and a grotesque mask, begins to jump and shout at no meaning. Acting completely erratically, confusion and fear seized everyone present. The king's behavior was not limited to one night. For days, Carlos VI continued acting strangely, dressed in extravagant attire and behaving unpredictably. His episodes of madness became increasingly frequent and serious, leaving the court in a constant state of panic. The king's mental health, the stability of the kingdom and the future of France hung from a thread. Prosody. Speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Remember that Carlos VI's mental instability was already evident in the midst of this climate of tension. A fierce rivalry between two powerful nobles emerged. Louis de Orleans, the king's brother, and Juan without fear, Duke of Burgundy. Both families disputed power and influence in court. You will see how this fight for the control of the kingdom intensified tragically. On the night of November 23, 1407, Louis de Orleans was ambushed and killed in the streets of Paris. The murderers, at the service of the Duke of Burgundy, attacked him with brutal efficiency, leaving him dead in the dark. The news of the murder was extended as gunpowder, shaking the foundations of the kingdom. You will understand the impact of this fact on the already fragile mental health of the king. The murder was a devastating blow to the stability of France. The death of Louis de Orleans not only eliminated an important member of royalty, but also exacerbated the tensions between the noble factions. A civil war was unleashed between the supporters of Orleans and those of Burgundy, which plunged the kingdom into an even greater chaos. For you, it will be clear that this fact precipitated a spiral of violence and madness. Thus, after the murder of Louis de Orleans, the madness of Carlos VI intensified. Imagine the king, once imposing, now prey of terrible delusions. One day, he thought he was a glass, fearing that any blow did it shattered. He refused to bathe, to dress, to perform the most elementary tasks of a monarch. His cut, in a constant state of panic, observed impotent his deterioration. On another occasion, he suffered a frenzy attack during a hunt. He threw himself into battle against his own gentlemen, believing to face invisible enemies. The scene must have been terrifying. The king, crazy, soffed his sword against those who had sworn to protect, while his courtiers fled in terror. These episodes were repeated with a terrifying frequency. Sometimes, it fell into a deep silence, a sepulchral mutism that lasted days, even weeks. Other times, he became aggressive, unable to discern the reality of his delusions. His mind, an acute and strategic once, was fragmented, a puzzle impossible to repurchase. The French court, divided and weakened by the internal struggles, observed impotence how its king sank into madness. Carlos VI's mental illness was not just a personal problem. It became a threat to the entire kingdom, a void of power that fed ambition and intrigue. His reign, once a symbol of greatness, was transformed into a tragedy of epic proportions. So imagine Carlos VI, a king unable to govern, mired in his delusions. His advisors, ambitious nobles, dispute power as vultures around a corpse. The different groups, each with their own interests, struggled to control the king, to whisper advice in their moments of lucidity, or even manipulate him in his episodes of madness. The court became a political battlefield, where loyalty was scarce merchandise and betrayal, current currency. The country, meanwhile, bleeding. The wars between nobles for the control of territories and resources multiplied. The economy staggered, while taxes rose to finance internal wars and the waste of the court. Justice was a luxury that only the powerful could afford. You, as a spectator of this turbulent era, could feel the tension in the air, the fear of uncertainty, the weight of a kingdom on the verge of collapse. External enemies took advantage of the weakness of the kingdom. England, always eager to expand its territories, saw the opportunity to conquer more French lands. In the midst of this chaos, the different noble factions competed not only for power, but also for the loyalty of cities and provinces, which aggravated the situation and turned the crisis into a civil war into a slow motion. The crown, in the hands of a crazy king, was no longer the symbol of unity that used to be, but an award to play, in a fight without barracks. So there were two powerful families, the Orleans and the Burgundy, confronted in a ruthless struggle for the control of the kingdom. Louis de Orleans, the king's uncle, was an ambitious, elegant man, surrounded by luxury. His rival, Juan without fear, Duke of Burgundy, was quite the opposite. A relentless, pragmatic warrior, with a penetrating look that said everything. Imagine the tension. The court divided into two sides, each supporting their favorite duke. The palatial intrigues, the whispers in the halls, the secret alliances, everything moved to the rhythm of the rivalry between these two titans. The situation was explosive, a furious wick about to explode. The struggle for power was not limited to court. Both dukes controlled vast territories, powerful armies, and used all the tools at their disposal to weaken on the contrary. Think of covert wars, conspiracies, murders, a fight without barracks for supremacy. Prosody, speak. Speak, a prosody rate equals 90%. And you, who would you have supported? To the elegant and ambitious Orleans or the pragmatic and ruthless Burgundy? The answer, like history itself, is complex and full of nuances. But what is unquestionable is that his struggle, his excessive ambition, plunged France into an even greater chaos than he already lived under the reign of the crazy king. So, the ambition of Louis de Orleans divided the kingdom. His supporters, the Armagnacs, faced the Burgundy, loyal to Juan without fear, the Duke of Burgundy. Imagine chaos. Two powerful factions, each with its own armies, fighting for power while the young King Carlos VI, already mentally weak, watched impotent. The civil war extended throughout the kingdom. Satuxiated cities, raised fields, the divided nobility. You could imagine the terror that the population must feel, trapped between two sides that only cared about their own ambition. The king, lost in his madness, was unable to control the situation, which worsened everything. The Armagnacs, initially with more support, began to lose ground. Juan, without fear, cunning and ruthless, gained ground with his military alliances and tactics. The fight became a butcher shop that bloody France, and the reign of Carlos VI became a mere symbol of a kingdom torn by violence. But expect what happened to the church while France bleeding. Imagine, two potatoes. Yes, the Great Schism of the West, a schism that divided Christianity for almost 40 years. A pope in Rome, another in Avignon. Who was Peter's true successor? The people, confused, wondered what mass to follow, what pope to obey. A crisis of faith that joined the political chaos. Common people, yourself at that time, would face deep uncertainty. Who to believe? Who to obey? The religious authority, the pillar of medieval society, had fractured. The schism not only weakened the church, but deepened distrust and division throughout Europe, including, of course, France. This religious conflict added more firewood to the fire of civil wars. While the nobles struggled for power, the church fought with itself. The lack of a unified religious authority aggravated the political crisis. Think about the impact. Morality weakened, faith staggered, and people became more susceptible to manipulation and violence. All this, while the king, soon known as El Loco, approached his moment of greatest madness. But let's go back to France. King Carlos VI, already plunged into his delusions, could barely govern. His kingdom, weakened by wars and instability, faced a new threat. England in 1415. The young King Henrique V of England, ambitious and cunning, landed in Normandy. His goal, to claim the French throne and submit the kingdom to his will. You imagine the tension, right? The fate of France beat a thread. The Battle of Agincourt was a catastrophe for France. The swampy terrain hindered the progress of the French cavalry. Its main force, the English archers, protected by their stakes, discharged a shower of arrows that tithed the French ranks. The French nobility, accustomed to chivalrous war, was disorganized and vulnerable to English tactics. It was a bloodbath. Thousands of French nobles died in that battle. The defeat was humiliating, a deep wound in national pride. The image of King Carlos VI, unable to control his kingdom, was even more tarnished by the inability of his generals. Agincourt marked a turning point in the War of the 100 Years, tilting the balance in favor of England. For France, it was the beginning of a long and dark period. The defeat in Agincourt was a devastating blow, but the worst was yet to come. For you, the collapse of the French kingdom was not just a matter of lost battles. It was the very image of chaos, and in the midst of that chaos, the figure of the king, already fragile for his mental illness, became a symbol of the debacle. His capture was not an isolated fact, but the culminating point of a long decline. Imagine the scene. The king, a man lost in the confusion of his own mind, surrounded by enemies, his few allies, unable to protect him, observe impotent. The capture of Carlos VI was not an epic battle, but an almost silent act, a symbol of the fragility of real power before war and madness. Think about the psychological impact it had for the French people. His king, the symbol of his nation, captured. Not only a military defeat, but the loss of hope, a leadership vacuum at a time of deep crisis. The king's capture was the final blow, the irrefutable proof of the decline of France. After Agincourt, the situation was desperate. France, death wound, desperately sought an exit. For you, humiliation was palpable, the image of a prisoner king, a symbol of the decline of the kingdom, and in the midst of that chaos, a solution arose that many considered a betrayal, the Troyes Treaty. Prosody, speak. Our prosody rate equals 90%. The treaty, signed in 1420, was a humiliating concession that you imagine the French nobles, forced to accept the union of France and England under the yoke of Enrique V of England. It was established that the heir of Enrique V, and not that of King Carlos VI, would be the successor to the French throne. France, in its fragility, gave its enemy. For you, it must have been a heartbreaking scene. Carlos VI, already weakened by his mental illness, signing his own condemnation and that of his kingdom. The treaty not only gave territories, but also delivered the future of France to a foreign power, sealing the fate of a nation that sank into the dark. Imagine life in the French court of Carlos VI. You, a minor nobleman, are in the midst of a whirlwind of opulence and decline. Endless banquets with exquisite delicacies, wines of the best vineyards, music and dance that extend until dawn. But after that luxury mask, misery hides in the shadows. The stalking plague, the famine hits the poorest and corruption carks the foundations of the kingdom. The court was a microcosm of French society. A mixture of power, intrigue, and despair. While the nobles competed for the real favor, the commoners suffered silently, diseases spread rapidly, and death was a frequent visit in marginal neighborhoods. Just one step away from the lavish Palaciga life yourself, you could witness the opulence of a real dance, and the next day, find the harsh reality of misery in the streets. The contrast was brutal, that a king apparently oblivious to reality, surrounded by unimaginable luxuries, while his people suffered, the excessive wealth of the court, sustained on a basis of poverty and inequality, was a reflection of the chaos that reigned in France. You, witness to this duality, ask yourself how you can coexist so much opulence with such misery. So close to each other, the decline was palpable, a premonition of what was to come. But opulence hid a bitter truth. Look at Queen Elizabeth of Bavaria, Carlos VI's wife, a beautiful woman, yes, but with a mental fragility that was reflected in the instability of the court. His delusions and humor changes were as unpredictable as the king himself, creating a constant tension atmosphere. You, as a silent witness, perceive latent fear between the servants and the nobility before their outbursts. The king's children, still children, grew in the midst of this chaos. The heir, Dolphin Carlos, watched everything with a look that already reflected the weight of an unstable crown. His younger brothers were wrapped in palatial intrigues, their children's games becoming a reflection of the power struggles that surround them. The royal family itself was a microcosm of the instability of the kingdom. The disputes between the different members of the royal family, amplified by the ambitions of the nobles, contributed to the fragmentation of power and the growing political instability. Concerted marriages, far from joining, seemed even more rivalries, turning the court into a battlefield where each one fought for their own interest. With real children as pawns in this deadly game, you, trapped in the intrigue network, you are a silent witness of this drama. But Isabel's fragility was not a private matter. His mental instability was projected in court, creating an environment of constant uncertainty. You could imagine the latent fear, the palpable tension at each meeting, every decision taken under the influence of a queen whose whims could change from one moment to another, his outbursts of anger, his periods of deep melancholy, all affected the governance of the kingdom. He directly influenced Carlos VI's decisions, a king already vulnerable to madness crises. Imagine the scene. Counselors trying to navigate the contradictions of an unstable queen and a mentally incapacitated monarch. His favorites, chosen in whim, rose and fell out of favor with the same speed that changed Isabel's humor. French politics became a game of chance, where the stability of the kingdom depended on a woman's moods. His palatial intrigues, his preferences for certain nobles, created divisions and conspiracies. Think about the damage caused by its instability. Broken alliances, unnecessary wars, the economy staggering under the weight of its impulsive decisions. The queen, unintentionally, sowed discord in the heart of the kingdom, weakening France at a crucial moment in European history. His influence, although involuntary, turned out to be devastatingly negative. That atmosphere of fear, you know it, It was not limited to the murmuring in court.it translated into actions, in silences loaded with meaning, in looks that could kill you. Isabel's instability, her influence in Carlos, became a perfect breeding ground for political intrigue. Can you imagine the power that moved behind the scenes, manipulating the king, using his fragility as a weapon? Prosody. Speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. The murders, although not always direct, were a usual tool that a political enemy did not need to be stabbed in the public square. A conveniently administered disease, a fall of a horse. The possibilities were endless. Death became a constant shadow, a silent threat that floated in the thin air of the French court. You might think that life in court was an elegant and refined dance, but behind the mask of the nobility there was a struggle for brutal and ruthless power. Each smile could hide a dagger, every kind word a betrayal. Death, like a dark company lady, was a frequent guest in the classrooms of Versailles, although at that time, the palace was not called that way. Imagine daily life in 15th century France. You, a farmer, you get up with the sun, the cold crowns you to the bones. The work in the field is hard, the arid land, but the harvest determines your survival. Your family awaits you, with the same uncertainty that you get you. The distance of the castle, a symbol of power and opulence, brutally contrasts with the reality of your existence. Hunger is a constant threat, and the disease an inseparable partner. In the city, the situation is slightly different, but not much better. Artisans work tirelessly in their workshops. The smell of wood and metal permeates the air. Commerce flows through narrow and muddy streets, a constant coming and going of people, of goods. But wealth is concentrated in a few hands, and poverty extends as a relentless shadow between houses. The plague, always stalking, can take your family overnight. Meanwhile, in the castle, life is an inaccessible luxury for you. The nobility lives in a world of opulence and power, surrounded by servants and luxuries. But even there, uncertainty and fear sneak between stone walls. The palatial intrigues, conspiracies, struggles for power are a constant. Life is a dangerous game, where loyalty is a scarce good and betrayal of a common weapon. But let's go back to the 15th century. Imagine that you are witness to someone's life with mental problems at that time. There were no diagnoses we know today. Madness, melancholy, mania were attributed to supernatural causes, the influence of demons or an imbalance of body moods. It was believed that mental illness was a divine punishment or a sign of demonic possession. The treatment, therefore, focused on exorcisms, bloody purgations, and other practices that today are cruel and ineffective. Medieval society did not understand mental illness as something that required medical understanding or help, but as a threat that should be controlled or eliminated. It was believed that these individuals were dangerous, unpredictable. Sometimes people with mental illnesses were locked in cages or confined in isolated places, treated as beasts. Other times, they wandered aimlessly, marginalized and feared by the community. His life was a constant struggle against misunderstanding, cruelty, and loneliness, a reflection of the limitations of knowledge and compassion of the time. Think about the suffering they had to experience. But what really happened to Carlos VI? That is the big question that has intrigued historians for centuries. Some point to a psychosis, a mental illness that made him lose contact with reality. Imagine his delusions, his outbursts of fury, his inability to govern with sense. He was a powerful king, but his mind seemed to play a cruel joke, plunging France in a period of instability. However, other historians propose a different explanation. Perhaps it was not madness, but a physical illness, an ailment that affected his brain and explained his strange behaviors. Think of diseases that could go unnoticed at that time: infections, cranial traumas. Any blow to the head could have caused drastic changes in their personality and mental health. The truth is that we will probably never know with certainty what happened to Carlos VI. The lack of precise medical records of the time and the difficulty in diagnosing mental illnesses in the past makes it a mystery that has remained over time. What we do know is that his disease had a devastating impact on France, a country that needed a strong leader and was plunged into chaos during his long reign marked by the disease. Imagine the time. There were no antipsychotics or treatments like the ones we know today. For Carlos VI, medicine was based on bloody purges and other practices that seem to us today. The less strange. It was believed that the disease was an imbalance of moods, and the solution was to restore the balance of the body, often quite aggressive. Prosody, speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. The bleeding, for example, were very common. It was believed that the toxins that caused the disease were eliminated when extracting blood. Combs, knives, and other instruments were used to open incisions in the veins and let the blood flow. It was a painful and often weakening procedure, but it was considered essential for health. In addition to bleeding, purges were another habitual treatment. A variety of concoctions were administered to patients, often unpleasant and nauseabundos, to induce vomiting and diarrhea, hoping to expel substances considered harmful. Think of bitter herbs, extracts of toxic plants, all with the aim of balancing those moods. Of course, more natural remedies were also used, such as certain medicinal plants and sentences. But the belief in the imbalance of moods and the need to purge the body was dominant. These treatments, far from helping Carlos VI, probably worsened his situation, weakening him even more. Imagine the uncertainty that should reign in France. You, a peasant, work the land day after day, seeing how the harvest is reduced by wars and political instability. The king, who should protect you, is different. The rumors reach your ears, stories of madness, of inexplicable fires, of nobles faced by the power in the absence of a lucid ruler. Fear is installed in your heart, a fear of the unknown, to an uncertain future where survival becomes a constant struggle. Taxes rise, insecurity grows. The nobles, exploited from the situation, face each other for territories and power, completely ignoring the needs of the people. You see how your neighbors go hungry, how the disease spreads without control. The church, which you go to consolation, seems helpless to chaos, while the nobility is enriching your coast. Angustia becomes a constant. Hope, a luxury that you can no longer afford. Prayer becomes your only weapon against despair. That I pray for the king's health, although you know that it is an almost useless prayer. Pray for peace, for harvest, for divine protection against famine and war. Meanwhile, life continues, precarious and uncertain, in a kingdom plunged into the crisis, where the madness of a king has unleashed chaos that threatens to consume everything in its path. The anguish is your partner, a shadow that lengthens with every day that passes. Think of the Louvre Palace, but in medieval times. Imagine gray, thick and very high stone walls, protecting a maze of rooms, pointy towers that are lost in the sky, narrow windows that let only a ray of light in, and a central courtyard where the palatial life was developed daily. It was an imposing place, a symbol of real power, but also a space where everyday life was mixed with pomp and ceremony. Within those walls, life was a mixture of luxury and austerity. The kings and the nobility lived surrounded by tapestries, dark and heavy wood furniture, and silver candlesticks. But remember that hygiene was very different from the current one, and living conditions, for many, quite precarious. Servants, guards, and artisans worked tirelessly to keep the palatial machine. Staterooms, chapels, real bedrooms, each space had its function. The big rooms were the scene of banquets, ceremonies, and political meetings. The chapel was a place of prayer and religious rituals, while the royal rooms were a reflection of power and luxury, although also probably cold and little welcoming compared to today's houses. Remember that imposing palace, right? Well, imagine that suddenly, a flare rises from one of its towers. The fire, initially small, spreads with a terrifying speed. The flames, as snake tongues, screw around the wood, devouring everything in its path. An accident. Some say that a simple forgotten candle near tapestries. But, do you believe it? The truth is that Carlos VI, our king, was peculiar. His mind, often, was lost in lowering of madness. Some whisper that the fire was intentionally an act of real madness. A fire that not only consumed the palace, but also the little sanity that had left. A premeditated act or a simple carelessness in the midst of the chaos of your mind. The real chronicles are ambiguous. They speak of a sudden fire, but also of the strange attitude of the king. Outside the general panic, while the palace burned, he watched impassively, from a window. Indifference, madness, or a sinister plan that only he understood. The flames devoured everything, and with them, any possibility of finding a definitive answer. The flames devoured the palace? Accident? Sabotage? History offers you several theories, some as crazy as the king's own personality. Some point to carelessness, a forgotten candle, a spark in the fireplace. But the magnitude of the fire, its rapid propagation, makes many doubt, was it really so simple, or is something more sinister hides? Prosody. Speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Another theory, more conspiracy, speaks of a plot. Imagine. Enemies of the king, perhaps noble unhappy with his erratic reign, could have caused the fire to destabilize real powered an act of carefully planned sabotage, taking advantage of the weakness of the monarch and the instability of the kingdom. Can you imagine the intrigue in court, secret alliances, hidden betrayals? And the most shocking theory, the most difficult to believe, could Carlos VI, in his madness, have ordered himself to destruction of his own palace? Some historians raise this possibility, arguing that an act of self-destruction fits with the king's mental fragility. A shocking image, right? A monarch who destroys his own world in a madness fire, but who perished in that hell. Imagine the scene, yourself witnessing the tragedy. Among the victims, nobles and servers, men and women, children. An irreparable loss for the French court. There is talk of the Countess of Ventadour, an important figure in court, her life truncated by the flames. Think of her face, in her last moments, the panic reflected in her eyes while the fire surrounded her. And the servants, those who work day by day in the palace, their families, their simple lives off in an instant. We do not know their names, but their stories tell us about a collective tragedy. Visualize your faces, your hands tanned by work, their lives interrupted in the blink of an eye by the relentless fire. Maybe there were children playing in the halls without understanding the magnitude of the danger. Think of your laughs, in your games, now interrupted forever. Imagine those little ones, trapped in the Fuego maelstrom, their innocent lives taken away by a tragedy that they could not understand. How many children died that night? History does not record it precisely, but its absence shouts silently. Think about the impact of that fire, the instability it generated in France. His madness, his inability to govern, left a power vacuum that fed civil wars and the fragmentation of the kingdom. You, as a spectator of the story, are witnessing how a reign marked by the tragedy left a deep mark on the nation. The inefficiency of Carlos VI in the government significantly weakened France, opening the door to internal and external conflicts that bled it for decades. Imagine constant tension, fear of violence, economic uncertainty. All that was legacy of his reign. Carlos VI's legacy is not limited only to wars and political instability. His reign also represented a period of suffering for the French people, who suffered hunger, diseases, and the constant threat of violence. You can understand how this era deeply affected the country's social fabric. Imagine the scene. The palace, reduced to ashes, a hell of smoke and flames. The court, before symbol of power and refinement, is scattered, desolate. Nobles, company ladies, servants, all fleeing chaos, their lives and their belongings reduced to ashes. The king, lost in his madness, was probably not even aware of the magnitude of the tragedy he had unleashed. The loss of lives was immense, but the destruction of the palace meant much more than that. Official documents, works of art, invaluable treasures, everything was lost in the flames. The vital information for the kingdom's government disappeared forever, leaving an administrative and political vacuum that would be added to the existing one by the madness of the king. Think about the psychological impact. The court, once a symbol of wealth and power, was mired in mourning and fear. Insecurity reigned. The confidence in the monarchy, already weakened by the king's mental illness, collapsed completely. The nobles, formerly rivals in palace intrigues, now shared a common traumatic experience. The loss of their home, and with it, a part of their identity. The fire marked a turning point in the already deteriorated mental health of Carlos VI. The tragedy, the loss, the chaos, everything contributed to an even more pronounced decline. His mind, already fragile, broke even more. The doctors of the court, unable to understand the true nature of his illness, treated him with ineffective remedies, worsening his situation. The years that followed were a slow and painful decline. His ability to govern faded completely. The regency, initially assumed by its relatives, became a battlefield of ambitions and conspiracies. You can imagine the environment of uncertainty and fear that wrapped France during this period. Finally, after decades of illness and interrupted reign, Carlos VI died in 1422. His death, although expected, marked the end of a turbulent era. The France that he inherited, relatively unified, was torn by civil wars and the ambition of the nobles. His legacy, in large part, is that of a king who could not control his own life, nor that of his kingdom. prosody speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. After the death of Carlos VI, his son, Carlos VII, inherited a ruinous kingdom. Imagine. Destroyed castles, cities in ashes, the divided nobility and the country mired in chaos. For you, rebuilding France would be a monumental task, a fight against the shadow of his father's madness. The 100 years was still in full boiling. The English, taking advantage of French weakness, controlled much of the territory. Your challenge was, in addition to rebuilding cities, expel the invaders. A titanic task, right? But Carlos VII was not alone. He had the support of key figures such as Juana de Arco, a peasant who inspired French troops with their faith and courage. Together, little by little, they managed to reverse the situation. Think about the hope that meant for a devastated people. The reconstruction was not just military. Years needed to lift cities again, rebuild the economy and restore order. Imagine the collective effort, the resilience of a people that, despite everything, rose from the ashes. Carlos VI's legacy was precisely that, the reconstruction of a kingdom. Imagine Carlos VII, young and with the heavy French crown on his head, touring a devastated kingdom, disrupted castles, burned villages. The inheritance of his father, Carlos VI, was a bleak panorama. But unlike his parent, Carlos VII had a strong determination. Rebuild France. Its path would not be easy. Civil wars, famine and Black Plague continued to whip the country. He had to unite a divided nobility, rebuild the economy and, above all, recover the confidence of his people. The task was monumental. He had to face the English, who still controlled a large part of the French territory. The war was still present, and each battle was a struggle for the survival of the kingdom. But Carlos VII was a cunning strategist, and little by little he was recovering land. His victories, although expensive, sowed the seed of hope in a country that seemed lost forever. The reconstruction was not limited to battles. Carlos VII focused on strengthening the economy, promoting trade and agriculture. He summoned assemblies, seeking the support of the nobility and clergy. The task was arduous, but the vision of a better future for France promoted it. He had to convince the nobles to leave internal struggles to fight for a common goal, the unification of their nation. Despite the advances, the recovery of France was a slow and painful process. The plague, famine, and internal disputes remained constant threats. But the perseverance of Carlos VII, his political cunning and his ability to inspire hope, were key to the reconstruction of a country that seemed condemned to oblivion. He succeeded, building step by step the road to a united and powerful France. Carlos VI's madness was not just a family tragedy. He had devastating consequences for France in the War of the 100 Years. His inability to govern effectively left the kingdom vulnerable to the English, who took advantage of the situation to expand their conquests. Think of the years of instability, internal disputes over power, the lack of a unified military strategy, all that played against the French crown. The weakness of the crazy king allowed England to consolidate his positions in French territory. Imagine the relentless advance of the English, taking strategic cities, imposing their authority, sowing terror and chaos. The French nobility, divided and weakened by the internal crisis, could barely oppose effective resistance. The French crown, in the hands of an incapable king, staggered on the verge of collapse. However, the madness of Carlos VI, paradoxically, ended up favoring his son, Carlos VII. His father's inability to govern allowed him, despite the catastrophic situation, gradually gaining the support of the nobles and the people. The reigning instability generated a void of power that Carlos VII, with patience and strategy, knew how to occupy. This situation, product of his father's weakness, became an unexpected opportunity for him. Imagine chaos, the uncertainty that reigned in France for decades, Carlos VI's inability to make crucial decisions. His mind, fragmented by the disease, paralyzed the administration. The internal struggles between the different power groups, taking advantage of the weakness of the king, intensified the war with England, leading France to the edge of collapse. You could have witnessed the political and social instability that seized the country, with devastating consequences for the population. Prosody / speak. Speak. The prosody rate equals 90%. Carlos VI's legacy is not limited to military defeat. His reign, marked by madness, left a void of power that deeply weakened the French institutions. The lack of firm leadership contributed to the inefficiency of the government, corruption, and generalized distrust. Think about the long-term impact on the economy of the kingdom, affected by wars and political instability. For you, that would be an era of deep uncertainty and suffering. The madness of Carlos VI serves as a historical case study on the fragility of power and the importance of stable leadership. His reign shows us how the mental illness of a ruler can have catastrophic consequences for an entire country. For you, this is a chilling example of how a person's mental health can affect the fate of millions. The story of Carlos VI is a warning about the vulnerability of societies against the inability of their leaders. But was it really a crazy king? You could ask yourself if the story has been fair with Carlos VI. His illness, probably a form of schizophrenia, was attributed to him as the only cause of his problems. However, the French court, full of intrigues and ambitions, played a crucial role in its decline. Power struggles among the nobles, constant manipulation, and lack of real support contributed to their instability. Imagine the pressure to be king at such an early age, deal with a devastating war such as the 100 Years' War, and face the constant threat of betrayal. How would you have reacted to such a burden? Its episodes of madness, far from being a simple weakness, could be interpreted as the result of a cluster of pressures, an extreme response to a hostile and treacherous environment. The story, written by the victors, often tends to simplify things. In the case of Carlos VI, the narrative of the crazy king became a convenient scapegoat. To understand it better, you should consider that his mental instability was exploited mercilessly by the noble factions that competed for power. His illness, thus, became a political weapon, a pretext for the internal struggles that torn France. But how has the image of Carlos VI arrived over time? The story, often, is written from the perspective of the victors, and in the case of a king with mental problems, the interpretation can be biased. Imagine the difficulty of judging the actions of someone who suffered a disease that today we barely began to understand completely. His erratic decisions, his moments of lucidity and madness, have been woven in a narrative that sometimes presents it as a monster, a simple madman, forgetting the historical context and the weight of a crown. Think of the chronicles of the time, written by courtly, noble, or even political enemies. What interests were describing the king? What did they seek to communicate or hide? Historical sources, although valuable, must be analyzed with a critical eye. Considering the bias inherent in each story, we cannot simply accept the description of a crazy king without questioning the motivations of those who described him like this. You must remember that history is a construction, an interpretation of the facts, not a mere objective transcription. Therefore, the image of Carlos VI that we have today is the result of a historical selection and construction process. An image shaped by the interpretation of events, with the influence of the prejudices of the time and the lack of understanding of mental illness. It is crucial that you, as a spectator, learn to analyze the sources and question the dominant narrative. Do not satisfy yourself with a simplistic vision. Deepen the nuances of history and build your own understanding of the crazy king. Imagine, for a moment, how such a tormented king has penetrated in popular culture. Its history, full of madness and tragedy, has inspired artists over the centuries in the cinema. Although he has not been the protagonist of great blockbusters, his figure has appeared as a secondary character, a symbol of the fragility of power and madness that can even corrode even the most powerful. Think about the dramatic possibilities offered by your life. In literature, his reign has served as a backdrop for historical novels that explore political intrigues and the consequences of their mental instability. Authors have imagined dialogues, letters, and scenes that try to give voice to their suffering, although, of course, always with the help of fiction. Can you imagine what a novel focused on your perspective would be like, your experience of madness? /prosody. /speak. Speak, the prosody rate equals 90%, and in art, from paintings to sculptures, his image has been represented in various ways, sometimes as a majestic ruler, others as a man tormented by his internal demons. Note how artists have tried to capture the complexity of their personality through their works, using different techniques and styles. What do you think is more successful, a realistic portrait or a more symbolic interpretation? But how does Carlos VI compare with other monarchs considered crazy? Unlike a king like Enrique VI of England, whose mental disorder manifested himself in a deep melancholy and passivity, the madness of Carlos VI was expressed through violent and unpredictable outbursts. Think about the difference. While Enrique plunged into introspection, Carlos faced reality with a devastating fury. This makes a crucial difference in the way both ruled their kingdoms. Even comparing it with Ivan the Terrible, whose cruelty was systematic and calculated, the madness of Carlos VI presented an element of unpredictability that made it even more terrifying. Ivan was a tyrant, yes, but his actions, although brutal, were to some extent rational within his twisted logic. Carlos's violence, on the other hand, sprouted from a well of mental instability, making his actions impossible to predict. And unlike other kings who perhaps suffered episodes of madness but maintained a certain degree of control over their reign with the help of regents, Carlos VI, in their worst moments, was completely unable to govern. His inability to exercise power in a consistent way had devastating consequences for France, opening the door to internal conflicts and weakening the kingdom against external threats. Its case represents an extreme in the fragility of a monarchy before the mental illness of its leader. But Carlos VI's madness was not just a personal drama. It had devastating consequences for France. His inability to govern effectively opened the door to the Civil War. The War of the 100 Years was intensified, and the country plunged into chaos. Imagine people's terror seeing their king, supposedly the protector of the kingdom, unable to exercise his authority. The real weakness allowed the rise of powerful features who fought for control, weakening the kingdom and leaving France vulnerable to English ambitions. Think about the long-term impact. Decades of conflict, the loss of territories, and the suffering of an entire population, all exacerbated by the king's instability. The inefficiency of the government during the reign of Carlos VI had a deep and lasting impact on French history. The fragmentation of power and political instability that he represented left an indelible mark on the development of the country. It was a dark period that deeply marked the French national identity. For you, what lesson can we extract from the history of this king? And here we arrive with the story of Carlos VI, a king marked by tragedy and madness. I hope you enjoyed this trip to the past, exploring such a fascinating and complex period of French history. Remember that this video is just a small part of a much bigger story, and I encourage you to investigate more on your own. I want to especially thank everyone who has made this video possible. To my subscribers, for your constant support and your suggestions, which help me improve every day. Your passion for history is my greatest motivation. I also want to thank all historians and authors whose works have served me. Your rigorous and passionate works have been fundamental for the creation of this video. Without you, this project would not have been possible. And of course, thanks to you for having dedicated your time to watch this video. I hope you have learned something new and that you have been interesting. Remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next videos and activate the bell to receive notifications. And so far the story of Carlos VI, I hope you have been interesting. If you liked it, give like and subscribe for more. What do you think about your reign? Leave it in the comments. /prosody/speak